Welcome to today's webinar, 5 ShoreTel key functions and how they really work. We decided today at LANtelligence to give you an example of what we've learned over the past 15 to 20 years of functionality that we learned how they actually worked after reading and learning for multiple years how things were written and how they actually work. So this is the difference between lab and production, if you will. All right. Hi, my name is Ken Zrobak. I'm the Director of Operations for LANtelligence. I have been a ShoreTel partner working with ShoreTel since way back in release 3 prior to release 4.1. So a lot of this has come over many years of learning the hard way. So basically, what is behind basic ShoreTel features is what we're looking at today. So what we're going to learn today is how PSTN Failover really works and the requirements for PSTN Failover, remote site call control in unexpected scenarios, distributed database in ShoreTel versus distributed workgroups in ShoreTel, SIP, virtual versus physical, and the hardware requirements, and scalability. Where can we comfortably scale? PSTN Failover is the first one we're going to talk about today. And really, what is PSTN Failover within ShoreTel? PSTN Failover is the ability to have the system fail over to a remote location or back to the headquarters to a predefined number. Now, this can happen in a couple of different ways. If you ever looked at PSTN Failover, you can set it up within the user profile in Shoreware Director or Connect Director. And what this does is at every site, you can configure a site bandwidth control. And if you ever wonder what that site bandwidth control is, that's actually the limit of voice traffic that the ShoreTel will actually send across. And once you exceed that, it'll start looking at PSTN Failover, because once you've exceeded that site bandwidth or the bandwidth's not available due to a WAN outage, it is going to go into failover mode. So what happens and where do we get caught up? So the first thing to understand is PSTN Failover is a really great feature. It's the idea that if I'm calling out of my Toronto office to the San Diego office and all of a sudden our MPLS goes down, our internet connection goes down, that the system will actually route calls out my local PSTN analog trunks to call either a user's DID, who I'm calling in the other location, San Diego, or it's going to send it to the main number if I don't have a DID or possibly a cell phone. Okay, what it doesn't do is it doesn't allow calls that come in through the auto attendant or through an external caller to come into one location, for instance, calling into the Toronto office, and then be able to 4-digit dial or enter the extension and have it transfer across. It only works for inter-site calls, so user to user. So I'm a user on a ShoreTel system at site A, I can call and use PSTN Failover for site B. If I'm an external caller and I call into my auto tenant in Toronto and I want to reach somebody in San Diego, I'm going to hear, I'm sorry, that extension is not available, because it doesn't work that way. Not sure why, because technically there's still a transfer between an auto tenant, but that's how it works. So it is really the ability to support inter-office, intra-site, or inter-site transfers between multiple locations. And we just talked about how PSTN Failover was supposed to work. Between one site to the other, it's not available. It goes to the PSTN Failover into the backup. Now, what we've learned and what we've found with many different sort of opportunities in the field and production is that one of the things you have to keep in mind is most sites, well, who uses PSTN Failover, I guess, is the first question. And a lot of times not everybody uses PSTN Failover, but what we see is we do have customers that because they have many locations and they really don't have MPLS at every location, they're really just using the ShoreTel to admin their smaller non-MPLS sites. So they can do single site administration, add users, move users, and have everything local. But what they were doing, or what they can do, is use PSTN Failover to allow calls to go from their head office to the remote sites. But what happens is, if I'm in this picture, if I'm at site A and I need to reach site B, you need to have connectivity there. So site A and site B need to have connectivity. Whether it routes through the headquarters or it goes directly in a full mesh environment, doesn't matter, but it needs to see it. And one of the challenges we found was that usually most remote sites talk to the headquarters. So conversations between the remote site and the headquarters using PSTN Failover, usually not an issue. It works fairly well. But what we found is some of the customers, or if you're deploying this, decide that, hey, if I'm not really supporting voice at my remote sites, why do I actually need to make network routes between the two? Why don't I just have everything come back to my main office? And what they do is they don't enable, if you don't enable routing between the sites, so the ShoreGear switches at site A can see the ShoreGear switches at site B, PSTN Failover will not work. And it will not work because the switches are using LSP updates, Location Services Protocol, to pass information and routing information, much like a routing protocol between the switches. And what we found in sites that don't have that connectivity, they never get the updates for those tables, so they can't reach it. Okay, but the question that I asked was, well, how's that any different from an outage? How is it any different from a WAN outage, or have you exceeded your bandwidth? And what ShoreTel engineers have come back to tell me is that the way that it really functions is, if there was a route and it's no longer accessible in the ShoreGear appliances, it then goes into PSTN Failover. If there is never a route there, PSTN Failover won't happen. It'll always go to the backup auto tenant. So PSTN Failover, for lack of better terms, is really a short-term solution, meaning that for whatever reason, if I lose that connectivity, or I lose that that connection between site A and site B, and for whatever reason I have to reflash that switch or reboot it and it doesn't get the update in the table, it will no longer do PSTN Failover. But if the sites were there and they were connected at one point and no longer connect, that's when PSTN Failover takes advantage. And one of the misnomers that I had thought, because TMS actually manages all the switches, which is managed by DRS, which is both managed at the headquarters site, so that the headquarters really has all the information, should be able to transmit that information to all the switches, but based on design, it doesn't. So even though site B has access to the HQ and TMS is managing the switches at site B, or if it's a larger, DRS is managing TMS, it is not updating the route tables between the two. That's actually done directly between the sites. So again, for PSTN Failover to work, a route has to have existed before a network outage or bandwidth exceeded the utilization level for PSTN Failover to work. If there was never a route there, a network route, and those updates weren't able to pass between those systems, you are not going to be able to do PSTN Failover. What you will hear is it goes to the backup auto tenant, and that is not a bug, that is as built. Okay, so basically that's PSTN Failover in a nutshell. And that's PSTN Failover. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at is remote site control, unexpected scenarios. This is something that after 10 plus years working with the ShoreTel, we couldn't figure out why we saw these behaviors, and we had to spend many hours with ShoreTel engineers to troubleshoot them. And really the scenario was, we had a customer that had hundreds of locations with MPLS, and typically every weekend, at least one MPLS connection went down, and they were getting some sort of strange behaviors. Until we dug into this is what we found. Again, a lot of the stuff we're talking about today is not documented anywhere, or if it is, it's buried so far deep you'd never get to it. So really the first thing we're looking at is, number one, HQ server down. So when a remote site loses connectivity to the headquarters, the hunt groups and the work group schedule stay in the mode that they were the moment the connectivity lost. Because keep in mind, if everything's at the headquarters, which everything was originally when ShoreTel first, well, way back when, everything like hunt groups was designed to work groups was designed to stay at the headquarters. Hunt groups was relying on the switch, and it resides on the switch. But what the key factor here is, when you have a hunt group or work group, they all connect back to the HQ for database changes. So a hunt group on hours, off hours, work group on hour, off hours is going to go back to the database that's located centrally at the headquarters to check to see if they can update their schedules. Okay, so now what we see is, if we move forward, what happens when we actually lose the connectivity between a remote location, or let's say that you have your HQ in a data center and you got hunt groups and work groups. Well, the last database update for the work group is going to stay, which means hunt group or work group, which means if you're a hunt group and you're based on a schedule, you're going to stay at that status. So for instance, if it was 6:59 a.m. and your hunt groups or your work groups turned on at 7 p.m. or 7 a.m., if the MPLS or the connection down to the data center was lost at 6:59, your hunt groups and work groups will stay in off hours mode. And what you might not realize is, if you actually bring up this connection back and it comes and restores at 7:01, the hunt groups and the work groups don't actually pull for a change in the update, so they will stay offline. So I believe you have to either go in and restart the work group services or reboot that switch and have the hunt groups recheck their database, they're on and off hour schedules. So what we normally do is we recommend that if you are using a hunt group at a remote location, try not to do it with a schedule. Okay, if you do it a schedule, because work groups is different, because work groups reside on a server, whether it's a distributed server or a headquarters server, it's getting the time from the server that it's on. With a hunt group, it actually waits and it relies on the connection back to the main database, which is at the HQ, to change its time. So by putting a schedule on a hunt group and you lose that database connectivity, your schedule is not going to change. And it's going to require some manual intervention, right? Either calling your provider like LANtelligence, or physically rebooting the switches and stopping and restarting the services on the HQ to get everything up and running again. So we recommend not to apply the schedules to the hunt groups if it's at a remote site. And typically most of them are, because they're residing on the switch. What you can do is you can use auto tenant menus to get to the hunt groups, which reside on the servers, versus putting the schedules on the hunt groups. The next scenario we're talking about is MPLS down, calls coming to a site with a DVS. So this again is a scenario where the remote site has a DVS, and a call comes into that site with the DVS, and there's no connection back to the headquarters. And this is all call behavior and call control. So if you've ever set up a call control or an auto tenant, you'll see that there's usually two settings: transfer to extension, which is one, or go to extension, which is the other. The two actually have different methodologies of controlling that call. One actually releases the call, the other actually maintains call control. If it can't find its remote destination, it actually pulls it back to the auto tenant. And if the MPLS is down, there's not a local auto tenant on that DVS, it's going to go to the backup auto tenant. Okay, and the scenario that we're going to talk about now is really a call comes into the local remote site. It has a DVS, it has an auto tenant, but it goes through the auto tenant menu, which has the transfer to extension. Well, transfer to extension, if you lose that connectivity to the headquarters, what's going to happen is when you press transfer to extension and that extension is not available, it is going to go to the backup auto tenant of the site. Okay, and that's not what you probably want. You want it to go to the user extension or go to a hunt group or a voicemail or something like that. So what we actually recommend is, to have this work, you want to use the go to extension instead of transfer to extension, because the go to extension releases the call control from the auto tenant that accepts the call, which means the call no longer has an owner and it's available to go to the destination it's supposed to. And apparently our time is backwards here, I see. So again, if you do transferred extension, you go to call that person, it's going to go to the backup auto tenant, and you're not going to get the results you expected. Your customer is going to say, why is this not working the way it's supposed to? Because I'm saying transferred extension and it goes to an auto tenant, because the transferred extension is holding on to that call control and not releasing that. So when it can't find that destination after 3 or 4 calls, it goes to the backup auto tenant instead of releasing it to voicemail, because it's all about control. The third scenario we're going to talk about is an MPLS down, call comes into a site with no DVS. So basically, if the MPLS is down, the auto tenant would be unreachable, and the calls would default to the backup auto tenant on the switch of the remote site. So the call comes into the remote site, it can't get to the auto tenant, so it's going to go to the backup auto tenant on the switch that it comes in on, or the location of the backup auto tenant, whether it be the T1, the local SG switch, or ShoreGear switch. So now we look at what happens when I'm coming in and calls are supposed to go to the auto tenant, and that connection, the MPLS to the headquarters, is down, and the only auto tenant is available on a managing server, or the HQ. So you got the loss of the connectivity. The calls can actually go to the backup auto tenant. Okay, again, not the expected behavior that you want. So what to do in this scenario? We actually recommend that you terminate the incoming calls on the hunt group, because that is local to the site. So this incoming call actually terminates on the local site's hunt group. Now, when you actually do that, you can forward it to the auto tenant at the HQ, to the extension of the auto tenant, which could be at the HQ or be any managing DVS that has that auto tenant. But keep in mind, when you lose this connectivity here, there's no database updates. So what you want to do is, before you get in that scenario, you want to actually have your configuration all set up so that it can rely on what is actually configured in the switch, not to make an active or dynamic update to the database. So you forward that hunt group to the auto tenant HQ, and you know when you set up a hunt group, it has a backup destination. Well, your backup destination is going to be the hunt group to a local backup operator. So really what we're saying is you're going to create 2 hunt groups. The first one is going to come in, and it's going to forward to the auto tenant. And then the backup destination of that first hunt group you create is actually going to go to the hunt group of the local operator or the hunt group at the site. So this will mean if this connection is down, the call is actually going to go to the backup destination, which is going to be a local hunt group that will be able to ring those phones. Okay, and again, keep in mind that we still recommend no schedule on here, because the same scenario we talked about earlier, even though you've done all this fancy configuration, if it's based on the schedules and this connection is down, it's still going to show the wrong on hours, off hours. All right, the next scenario is getting out there, meaning you're not going to come across this a lot, but if you are somebody who has multiple ShoreTel images deployed to accommodate the requirements, we have a customer who deploys Workgroups everywhere, and you have to actually, up to one point, had 6 different HQ images. So what they did was they would actually forward calls between SIP trunks, and they do SIP tie trunks between all the sites. And this one is really addressing if the remote site doesn't belong to the same image as the HQ. So this may not be something that you come across, but this is the scenario that we've come across. So in the scenario where your remote site is actually tied to a SIP trunk, which 4-digit dials to another inter-office dialing, or the MPLS is down, that it's not the auto tenant is not reachable to the backup auto tenant. I mean, it's very much similar to the previous one. What we're talking about is we lost our WAN connectivity. Everything's going to go to the backup auto tenant, and we're going to use the same strategy here. So we're going to terminate incoming calls on a hunt group at the remote switch, and then forward it to the auto tenant. Now this can be, a 4-digit extension. So this could be the auto tenant at image 1 or at image 2 or image 3. Because it's a 4-digit extension, it doesn't matter what number you're actually forwarding it to. Okay, and then again, the backup destination is going to be a backup hunt group. So this is probably a less frequent type of scenario, but again, it works the same way. utilizing things of the backup destination to keep it local, and having the primary one to try and go to the remote, the headquarters location. So the third feature that we want to talk about is distributed workgroups versus distributed databases. Now, originally, I go back far enough to realize that, or to know that at one point you could not distribute workgroups. Workgroups were literally at one location. So if you had a ShoreTel workgroup, it resided on the HQ. Then ShoreTel actually put in, I think probably release 9, a distributed database. Okay, and this is something that sounds great until you understand what it actually does. And out of our 300 plus customers, I'm not sure I can name any that actually use distributed databases. More will use distributed workgroups because it actually makes more sense. But it's important to understand the difference between these two and how they relate to each other. As I just mentioned, workgroups originally were designed to be at the headquarters or be managed by the headquarters. What we really came into as ShoreTel and the product started to grow and expand was it was great at multiple site distributed architecture, but the problem came in is, or the problem was first exposed, is what happens when I have calls coming into this site through a T1 and I have my agents in here because this is where my customer service works, but it's being managed by my headquarters. It was sort of a less efficient way of having this headquarters have to connect to and manage all these calls. Also, it made it very dependent on that WAN connection, so that you can imagine that your call routing and all that sort of enhanced algorithms that the workgroups do is not going to be available once you lose that connection. So it made sense to sort of put those workgroups local to where the agents are, and more importantly, local to where the trunks are. Again, the PowerPoint is catching up to what I just mentioned. Was it made more sense to distribute the workgroups at the local sites. Now, distributed databases. Let's look at that. It's a copy of the local ShoreTel HQ that actually gets distributed against other distributed voicemail servers or DVS servers. It provides the ability to administer the ShoreTel system even if the HQ server is offline. That is absolutely incorrect. What happens is it makes a copy of the configuration database and copies it to the other DVMs in the system or DVSs in the system. So the first thing is, if I distribute a database, it doesn't allow me to open up Shoreware Director or ShoreTel Connect Director and admin the system because I have a distributed database because my HQ has gone down. Okay, but what it does do, it makes copies of those configuration databases and propagates it to the local DVMs. So that if I got a distributed work group, or I have a distributed hunt group that's being managed by that DVS, and it's using a time schedule, it is more likely to get that update with the local database. Now it's read-only, as opposed to if the wide area network is down and the HQ is off. So keep in mind, it's copies of that database. It doesn't actually allow you to update, but what ShoreTel will do is it continually updates that database. So if you make a change in the HQ, it will propagate those changes. But in a scenario where I talked about earlier, where you've lost your WAN connectivity and you've lost that schedule, if it's local, then it can actually read that schedule and have access to it. But again, it's not doing any updates. So this can give local database connectivity to the site. But again, it is just a copy of that database. It is not an administration of that database. And the other thing to keep in mind is distributed databases and workgroups are mutually exclusive. Means you cannot have these two functioning in the same system. So you have to choose your poison. Is it a distributed workgroup or is it a distributed database? And like I said, in my time and experience, 99.999979s usually means it has a distributed workgroup because the functionality just makes more sense than the distributed database. I haven't had anybody, call us up and say, "Oh, thank God I had distributed databases." Right? It just doesn't. It's just a feature that's not used in practice a lot, because I think sometimes if it is put in place and it's under the guise that it will allow you to provide administration of your system when the HQ is offline, is incorrect, and that is not going to work. So if you set up distributed databases instead of distributed workgroups because you think you can admin the system if your local site goes down or your HQ goes down, you are incorrect. It is not going to work. Right, next one is SIP, physical or virtual. Physical implementation is limited by 2 switches and a trunk group and how far we can scale. So physical SIP. Physical SIP is really, this is where we have to go back and do a history lesson. ShoreTel has been supporting SIP since release 4. SIP trunks, tie trunks, so tying into conference bridges back in the day, tying to fax servers. It's supported SIP since release 4. But what it hadn't done was really release or support ITSP, Internet Telephony Service Provider SIP trunks, until much later. I believe it was 9 or 10. And that's also in combination with a session border controller. But on an actual physical switch, you have a limitation of the number of media proxies and ports that you can assign. Now, typically at this point, since virtual SIP has come out, the virtual IP SIP switch, the SIP trunk switch, I'd find it really hard to ever go to a physical SIP switch to provide SIP trunks, unless I'd already purchased that equipment and I was repurposing it for SIP trunk. As you can see here, a T1K or a 220T1 can actually be provisioned to provide 20 SIP trunks with 24 media proxies for a total of 24 SIP trunks. Now, media proxies are important because media proxies came in with, I believe, release 13, and up until that point, the ShoreTel switches, when they had provided SIP, didn't actually manage that stream, that RTP stream. So it really didn't have much control. It's kind of like a pass-through. And with the advent of the reprovisioning of SIP, which I believe was in 13, and the media proxies are actually there so that it can hold on to those calls so that you can do transfers, conferences on SIP trunks. You can have those media proxies to do that information. And really, they've rerouted the SIP through the media proxy so they can actually control what's going on. And they've really sort of jimmied the existing physical to accommodate SIP, because for a long-standing time they had SIP, which was as a sort of a secondary thought into the switches. So there are options in sort of the 14.2 and earlier, and in the Connect version, you've got the 2D, the ST1D, and the 100DA, which is the two T1s, the 1D1, the 1T1, and the 100 with a digital, which is analogous to the 220T1A, which provides 38 SIP trunks. But trust me when I say this, if you have the opportunity to deploy the OVA file for the virtual IP SIP trunks or SIP trunk switches, you want to versus the physical switches. And I'm saying this from experience because we've actually done testing for many ITSPs, and there's a few that we've actually certified because ShoreTel has them come to a partner who validates their testing. It's like a 60-page document of case studies that we have to go through. Now, a virtual SIP trunk, when you're doing physical, you have to worry about the proxies. You have to worry about that you have enough media proxies to accommodate this. And it really is sort of a secondary resource that you have to require. When you go virtual, it comes either with 500 SIP trunks with a 1-to-1 match of SIP or media proxies. So you never have to worry about managing or architecting that you have enough media proxies, or find out that you get into a situation where you require media proxies and all of a sudden functionality is not working. The other thing that I want to mention is that these virtual SIP trunk switches were designed to handle ITSPs, Internet Telephony Service Providers. So it was designed to handle SIP trunks, whereas the ShoreGear switches were sort of retrofitted to support SIP trunks. So that's why if you have a VM environment or you have to spin up an ESX host just to put the virtual appliances on there, it's worth it, because even in testing with ITSPs, every time we spin up a virtual SIP trunk switch, it's probably, I was going to give a percentage, but it works out of the box with less challenges than it does with the physical. And oftentimes when we're asked to do ITSP validation for ShoreTel, you have to test it on both the physical and the SIP, because there is a difference between the two. And they're trying to sort of remediate that so that they're fairly similar. But again, if you have the opportunity, use the virtual SIP trunks as much as possible. Scalability. This is our last topic. Scalability, and this is really what we're talking about, being fast and loose with the numbers. And oftentimes you look in the spec sheet, ShoreTel can support 20,000 ports. So 20,000 IP phones, 500 switches, 21 servers, 1 HQ and 20 DVSs, as well as 100 V switches, right? How does this actually look in real life? So you mentioned earlier that we had a customer that deployed many work groups. Well, because of the work group limitation, they had maxed out the number of work groups they could have on one image, so they had to deploy multiple ShoreTel images to accommodate their 200, 300 plus locations, because they wanted local work groups at most of those locations. So port is a user trunk, 20,000 ports, 500 switches. 20,000 users doesn't include any trunks. I believe the maximum for the trunks is 5,000 trunks. Switch resources. What is a port? A port is a user or trunk. 20,000 users don't include any trunks. 20,000 ports equals 500 switches. If nothing else, it's using up switch resources. Okay, you've got switch resources, which are trunks, extensions, conferences, hunt groups, BCAs, bridge call appearances, monitor buttons with additional buttons to monitor additional IP phones. Real-time capacity. The ShoreGear series had 80 ports, where the ST has 120. Trunks and trunk groups, analog trunks, digital trunks, SIP trunks, and virtual SIP trunks. So a virtual SIP trunk switch will support up to 500 G79 trunks. So there are many parameters that affect your ability to scale. So many options to maximize your ShoreTel system. As I mentioned before, the number of work groups. Going back here, depending on how you design the system, the number of conference, the number of trunks, which I think maxes at 5,000, number of hunt groups, number of bridge call appearances. Even with the virtualization in release 14 and Connect, they've added with the VM hosts the ability to handle more hunt groups and more bridge call appearances to give more capacity, right? There's also limitation on paging, right? You can't page, well, there's certain resource qualifiers in paging, because anytime you page or a hunt group, think about a hunt group. Hunt groups max out at 16 users, 16 hunt groups, because every time a call comes in, that stream is going to be replicated 16 times. Not only is that sort of bandwidth consideration, but it's also a CPU consideration on the ShoreGear or the ST switches. Now it's lessened by the fact that they now have virtual SIP trunks or virtual IP switches that can be run on a VM that can have a higher core, more memory, so the CPU can actually handle more, and that's why you're going to see more additional resources on the virtual IP switches or the virtual SIP trunk switches. And that's something to keep in mind when you have a virtual, or you're not doing virtual right now. With release 14.2 and greater, you can deploy the virtual IP trunk switch, the virtual IP switch for nothing, just the space that you have on your VMware host. All right, we're at 33 minutes, and that's the end of today's presentation. So thank you very much. This is a re-recording of the actual demo, because we lost that recording. So if there's any additional information or questions you have, you can email me, reach me, follow us on Twitter. Take a look at our technical videos on YouTube. Also follow us on LinkedIn. And again, if you come across, and a lot of the videos, I think we have 30 to 40 videos, are more technical and demonstration videos on there. And a lot of times it's the genesis of a customer or client who's saying, how do I do this? How do I insert a certificate, a wildcard certificate in the conference bridge? How do I deploy the virtual appliance? How do I add a user mobility? And take those opportunities to create a video to really allow you as a client or user to go in and really do some self-service, troubleshooting SMTP issues on your network, all those sort of things. So if you do have any questions or any recommendations or things that you'd like to know, feel free to reach out to us at any one of these locations. My email address, some content or some suggestions for videos, and we'll get to it and subscribe, and then you'll see them show up in your email. Thank you and have a great day.